And welcome to Doubts Welcome, a ministry dedicated to answering your doubts, questions, and concerns about the Bible, God, and Christianity. Today, as you can see, we're continuing our Bible study series in the Gospel according to John, looking at John chapter 3, verses 22 to 30. Now, there's not a whole lot of theology in this passage, and most of it actually does coincide pretty well with what we talked about in John chapter 1, considering John the Baptist here. If you haven't seen those videos or the previous ones where we talked about Jesus' conversation with Nicodemus, then I would suggest going back and watching them at some point, because as I said before, context is king, but at the moment you can finish watching this video without having to worry about missing out on anything. The main focus of this little chunk of text here is that Jesus is greater than John, and we have John himself here saying this. With that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into our text for today. After this, Jesus and his disciples went to the Judean countryside, where he spent time with them and baptized. John also was baptizing in AENON near SALIM, because there was plenty of water there. People were coming and being baptized since John had not yet been thrown into prison. Then a dispute arose between John's disciples and a Jew about purification. So they came to John and told him, "Rabbi, the one you testified about, and who was with you across the Jordan is baptizing, and everyone is flocking to him." John responded, "No one can receive a single thing unless it's given to him from heaven. You yourselves can testify that I said, 'I am not the Messiah, but I've been sent ahead of him.' He who has the bride is the groom. But the groom's friend, who stands by and listens for him, rejoices greatly at the groom's voice. So this joy of mine is complete. He must increase, but I must decrease." Alright, so what's going on here? Some texts will say that Jesus went to the land of Judea. They might also say the Judean territory, the Judean province, or just Judea. Now, Jesus was in Jerusalem talking to Nicodemus last we knew, and of course he had the signs that he was performing just before that, so he's already in Judea because he was in Jerusalem. The Judean countryside, which the translation I'm using as well as other translations give, is probably a better translation. The idea here is that Jesus is going out of the city and into the country. Now, what about this AENON of Salem? Where was it? Well, we're not 100% sure. It's kind of been lost to history along with a lot of other places, but if we look at this map here, this is one of the ideas for a location of it. And if you see on the bottom right-hand corner, you have a red square, so you can see the bigger picture. The longer lake or sea down here is the Dead Sea, and then up here you can see is the Sea of Galilee. So this is kind of far north. Now I do want to be clear, this is not where Jesus had gone when he went into the country of Judea. Matter of fact, if we look at another map, we have AENON of Salem up here where I've made a star, and Jesus was in Judea. You can see the color of the country, and I'm going to outline it just for emphasis. So this little bit of information here shows us that the baptismal ministry of John and the baptismal ministry of Jesus, while they were taking place at roughly the same time, were, in fact, distant from each other geographically. Now that leaves the question, did Jesus baptize other people? Well, this is the only mention of Jesus having a baptismal ministry of any kind, and a little bit later in John chapter 4, verse 2, we see that it wasn't Jesus himself baptizing, but actually his disciples. So he conferred this right and honor onto them to baptize others, and that's probably a good thing, because I imagine there were probably some disputes like, "Oh, well, you were baptized by John, I was baptized by Peter, oh, you were baptized by Paul." Imagine if Jesus had done it, and someone would really be like, "Well, I was baptized by the Lord himself," so, yeah. So that's probably a good thing Jesus didn't baptize. So in short, no, he did not baptize other people. I think it's also important to note here that this is not Christian baptism per se. This is a precursor and even a model of Christian baptism, the model upon which Christian baptism came to be. And there are some similarities. Both this baptism and Christian baptism are for repentance and are also for a commitment to what you're getting baptized into, so to speak. But Christian baptism is more about a representation of how we ourselves, having committed our lives to Christ, are now spiritually dead and buried and have risen to life again spiritually as a new creation. So there is quite a bit of difference between the two, and obviously at this point in time, Christ had not yet died and been buried and raised again. Now there's this little statement in verse 24 here about John not yet being in prison. This is important because what this tells us is that everything that's happened up to this point in the Gospel according to John is supposed to have taken place before John the Baptist gets thrown into prison. And I say it's important because if we look at Mark 1:14, it says, after John was arrested, Jesus went to Galilee and preached the good news of God. Now, if you read the other 13 verses of Mark chapter 1 before this, we are told that it's the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, and then we are told about the prophecy in Isaiah about the one in the wilderness making clear the paths of the Lord, and we're told that that is John the Baptist. We're told that John is baptizing people, that he baptizes Jesus, and he gives a little bit of a statement, the one coming after me is greater than I'm not even worthy to untie his sandal, much like is said in John chapter 1. But then we're given this verse. So we aren't told anything about the ministry of Jesus before John gets arrested in the other three Gospels. And I say the other three because Matthew and Luke follow along with Mark pretty well, adding in a little bit of information here and there. Hence why they're called the Synoptic Gospels, and this Gospel is not included in that synoptic category. Now, what about this dispute arising? This is a little bit of an odd portion of the text. Not odd in the fact that the dispute happened, but in what happens after the dispute. We have here a Jew, or maybe the Jews, depending on which set of manuscripts you're looking at, and they're arguing with the disciples of John the Baptist about purification. Now, baptism or ritualistic washing, they're all for purification purposes, and there were, of course, laws for this in the Mosaic Law. There were also traditions that had been built up over time that weren't in the Mosaic Law, at least not in the written copy. They were, again, traditions passed down orally, and so this Jew would have been talking to them about that, and may have even been wondering if there was a difference between what Jesus was doing and what John was doing, hence what comes up here in a little bit. Now, something that I think is interesting before I move on to that, though, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were found back in the 40s, or at least reports about them were done in the 40s, we find a lot of talk about purification rituals. And the community near this area where the scrolls were found is called Qumran. And because of that, some people have wondered if this Jew or group of Jews were from Qumran and were debating with John's disciples about that. Some even think that John himself may have been, at least for a little bit, an Essene or part of that community. The Essenes are a sect of Judaism which was in Qumran and other places as well. The people who think John might have been part of that think he split eventually. I'm not sure if he was or not. There are some likenesses, but that's not enough for me to say that he was, so. But anyway, these Jews may have been from there, and that may have been why they were debating purification. I mean, as I said, their reaction to this, the disciples of John, their reaction to this, is a little odd. They go and they tattle on Jesus. Hey John, guess what Jesus is doing? But in all seriousness, I mean, Jesus had to have come up in the conversation. Otherwise, there's no reason for them to go and tell John about it, right? It doesn't connect. Now, this is understandable. I mean, they want their rabbi to be the one that everyone comes to, and when things get passed on to them, so that they are now the rabbi instead of John the Baptist, then they want people to come to them as well because they were a student of John, right? So they're looking for some job security. It makes sense. And the fact that everyone was flocking to Jesus, which is obviously hyperbole, but we do that too. But the fact that that was going on was worrying to them. And it makes sense. We're humans. We understand that. However, John doesn't respond the same way they did. And I think his response is a good example for ministries today. Now, I'm going to be paraphrasing what I believe John was saying, but you'll get the gist of it. Firstly, God is blessing his ministry. That's what John is saying when he says that no one can receive anything unless it's from heaven. And so John sees that his ministry is waning, and Jesus' ministry is picking up speed. And in our ministries today, we need to look at that as well, because there's going to be some ministries that are doing really well, reaching lots of people, like Billy Graham, per se. And there'll be other ministries that aren't doing that well. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but that's probably just goes to show that those are the ministries there. Mine right now is brand new. I have no idea if God's going to bless it. I'm going to be talking to lots of people, or if it's just going to be, for me in the future to rewatch these videos. But no matter what, I'm going to try and have the same attitude as John here and be like, this is what God is doing, and that's fine. The next thing John basically says is, I'm not the Messiah, only a messenger. And again, we as ministries need to keep that in mind. We're not the most important people here. Our story is not important. Getting people the gospel, that is important. Bringing them into the relationship with the true Messiah, that is important. And we are just messengers. We need to be happy with bringing in even 1 or 2 sheep. We don't need to bring in millions and millions and millions. We just need to be faithful in doing what God has called us to do. This next little part I want to talk about further in the next slide, but it's about Jesus being the groom, basically, and John being the best man, the friend of the groom. So we'll talk about that here in a second. The last part here, he must increase, but I must decrease, is a very important phrase. And this isn't so much of the idea of looking at another ministry and thinking, well, that ministry has to increase and my ministry has to decrease, but the idea that Jesus and God, they need to increase and we need to decrease. We don't need glory. We don't bring glory on ourselves. We are giving God and Jesus glory by pointing others to them. And that's the important part. Now, what's this idea about Jesus being the groom? Well, throughout the Bible, marital imagery is used profusely. In the Old Testament, Yahweh is married to Israel. They are his bride, his wife. He is their groom. The idea of that kind of a relationship is what's going on. When Israel goes and worships other gods, they are cheating on God. That's what the text says. They are committing adultery. In the New Testament, we have Jesus being the bridegroom to the church. Not just here, but in other passages as well. And the church being Christ's bride. So the idea of the friend of the groom being the one who stands by and listens for him and rejoices at his voice, we have the same idea in our weddings. We have a best man, and the best man, aside from planning the bachelor party and everything else, they, along with some help of course, but they are the ones who are really in charge of making sure that the ceremony and celebration goes well. Normally them and, say, the head bridesmaid are the ones to do that. And it's the same here, that we, as the messengers, as the friend of the groom, are to bring people to the groom and celebrate that. And so again, we're not the most important people. Jesus is. And the fact that John saw that he had pointed a bunch of people to Christ, and even some of his own disciples had gone and become disciples of Christ, that is why his joy was complete, because his job was being done. And I have no doubt in my mind that up until he got thrown into prison, he was still pointing people to Christ, and even then, if the guards would let him talk to them, he was probably pointing them to Christ as well, until his head got taken off, but that's for another video. And it won't be in this series on John, because those are the last words of John the Baptist here in John. And that is where we're going to end this video for today. If you liked it, please give me a thumbs up and leave a comment down below. If you think it'd be helpful for your family, friends, or church group, please share it with them in any way that you can. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe and hit that bell notification icon so you know when I post new videos. And until next time, bring on the doubts, because you are always welcomed.